The Court considers that, with regard to the present situation, Israel must, in accordance with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention, in particular, A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. The Court recalls that these acts fall within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention when they are committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part the group as such. The Court further considers that Israel must ensure with immediate effect that its military forces do not commit any of the aforementioned acts. The Court is also of the view that Israel must take measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to the members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. The Court further considers that Israel must take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Israel must also take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of Article 2 and Article 3 of the Genocide Convention against members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip.
Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm your host, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. In January, the International Court of Justice ordered provisional measures against Israel in response to its military operations in Gaza. But today, South Africa has once again stepped onto the global stage, requesting the ICJ to impose further measures in light of Israel's statements regarding a new offensive on the city of Rafah near Gaza's border with Egypt. Tonight, we ask, what will it take to rescue Palestine? To help us unpack this complex sequence of events, we're joined in studio by the senior researcher at Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, or MISTRA, Mr. Naeem Jina, as well as lecturer at the UNISA Department of Jurisprudence, Memetlwe Sibai, who will join us in the second segment. We're also joined on Zoom by the Chief Executive of the UK Lawyers for Israel, Mr. Jonathan Turner. Let's begin our discussion this evening. Mr. Jina, thank you so much for joining us. You've been an outspoken voice in favor of the Palestinian cause for a very long time in South Africa, and of course, outspoken in this recent situation in Gaza. What do you make, to begin with, and I'll also ask Mr. Turner this, of South Africa's urgent announcement today that it will return to request the ICJ to consider yet further provisional measures in the light of this landmark ruling in January, which already ordered a series of measures?
I think it's an indication of the shock and frustration, certainly from the South African side, but we're hearing the same kind of shock and frustration from around the world. 18 days after the ICJ handed down its order, instructing Israel to do all of those things that we heard the judge say, they continue bombarding Palestinians. Every day for the past 18 days since that order was handed down, they've been murdering around 130 Palestinians on average per day. They've had snipers shooting people in hospitals. And now Rafah, which is a town that normally the residents of that town is about 300,000, now is housing 1.5 million people. 1.2 million of those are refugees. Basically, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. Sorry to use that kind of analogy, but that's what the Israelis are saying they will do, and there's no one to stop them. So the South African action today is out of that kind of frustration. The ICJ has handed down an order. No one is acting on it. Israel goes about as if the ICJ doesn't exist, as if international law doesn't exist, as if all that exists is its racism. And does what it likes.
Mr. Turner, I wonder how you respond to South Africa's announcement today that it will seek the ICJ to, of its own motive, institute yet further additional measures given what has happened since the January ruling?
Well, I think it is going to waste the court's time. The position is that Israel is developing a plan, as I understand it, to evacuate as many people who are currently in Rafah as possible to areas north of Rafah in order to be able to conduct its necessary military operation to destroy Hamas, which is necessary to protect Israelis, but also necessary to enable some possible future of a resolution of this conflict, which has gone on too long. It's not possible with Hamas in place in Gaza. So Israel is trying to evacuate is preparing a plan to evacuate the people currently in Rafah, so that it can complete the job, to complete the operation of destroying Hamas as a military operation and as the government of Gaza, so that a new arrangement can be made for the administration of Gaza until hopefully some form of settlement of this conflict can be attained.
Mr. Gina, how do you respond to that? The idea that
it's rubbish. The latest person to say so is David Cameron, not by any means a Hamas supporter or even a Palestinian supporter, who said there is nowhere for people in Rafah to go. There's nowhere to go. I mean, they surrounded, it's a small area, they squeezed into that 1.5 million people, and they're going to be shot and bombarded. And this nonsense about Hamas, I mean, 28,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza in the past 4 months. A few hundred of them have been resistance fighters. The rest are civilians. So this thing about finishing the job, don't shake your head. Finishing the job, means for the Israelis, finishing the job means getting rid of Palestinians. That's why they've been insisting that Egypt must take them. That's why they've been insisting that the rest of the world, all countries in the world, must take them. Why? They have homes. But they're bombarding them, they're killing them. Now they squeeze into a small area where bombarding and killing them is easier. I mean, Nasser Hospital yesterday, 7 people killed by a sniper trying to enter the hospital. This is just simple genocide. And the court has said there's plausible reasons for that. The court has said what needs to be done. The notion that Israel is going to prepare a plan for it, have they prepared a plan for the past 4 months to save civilians? No, they haven't. That's why 28,000 people have been killed. There's no plan. And if you want peace, don't talk about getting rid of Hamas, which is an elected government, by the way, was elected. Get rid of Likud, which is racist, which has in its charter the understanding that Israel is a great geographical area.
Let's give Mr. Turner an opportunity to respond to that. So far, the debate for the viewers who are joining us is about this new step from South Africa. You've spoken about an Israeli plan to try and evacuate citizens from Rafah. Of course, Mr. Gina has said that there's nowhere for them to go. How do you respond to the response to your intervention, Mr. Turner?
Well, first of all, the Israeli army estimates that 10,000 Hamas and other terrorists have been killed. So clearly there is a dispute at that, and it's absurd to suggest categorically that it's only a few hundred. It is quite likely to be 10,000, given the scale of the disintegration of the Hamas forces in hard-fought battles. And it is very unfortunate that civilians do get killed. It is regrettably inevitable in urban combat. In fact, the casualty ratio of civilians to fighters to combatants has been much lower in the Gaza Strip than in urban conflicts worldwide. The average in 2021, according to a UN survey, was 8 civilians for every combatant. So to get the casualty rate lower than 2 to 1, because of course the 30,000 includes not only the estimated 10,000 Palestinian terrorists, but also includes those who've been killed by Palestinian fire, either in the crossfire, which is unfortunately has to go on until Hamas completely surrenders, and also in those Palestinian rockets that are unreliable. 20% of them explode and land on the Gaza Strip, killing civilians and presumably also some terrorists as well. So the position is that terrible though it is to have all these civilian casualties, it is actually a testament to the care that Israel takes, that they are not than this. And you may laugh, but how many casualties have occurred in the Syrian conflict, which you don't mention? 200,000 civilians have been killed there. And that's in areas which are not necessarily urban, densely packed urban areas.
Right. Let's allow Mr. Gina a chance to respond to you again. And we have a long show this evening, so we'll allow the debate to continue to unfold. But Mr. Gina, just to summarize, the statement is that using IDF figures, the number of civilians is actually much lower than many other estimates suggest. What do you make of that response?
Firstly, it's a well-used Zionist trick to use whataboutery. We can have another show about Syria, and I'll tell you what I think about Syria. That's irrelevant to this issue. As far as the figures are concerned, no, he's going even beyond what the IDF is saying, frankly, right? 10,000, more than 10,000 of those 28,000 that have been killed are children, right? So where are the 10,000 so-called terrorists? Another 4,000, 5,000 of them are women who have not been fighters. Okay, so where are the 10,000? And by the way, this notion that in the north, the IDF has destroyed Hamas, now they have to just destroy them in Rafah. The Associated Press had an article about 3-4 days ago, where in Gaza city, far north, where the IDF claims to have full control, Hamas fighters were arresting looters, Palestinian looters, and marching them down the street. How is this? How is Hamas destroyed in that area? There's no such thing, right? All they are doing is they massacring civilians. And this thing about the lowest, etc., most moral army, all of that nonsense. I mean, more children have been killed, were killed in the first 2 months after 7th of October than were killed in the whole year in wars around the world, including Ukraine. So this thing is really nonsense and laughable, frankly, if it were not so tragic.
We're going to take a break, and of course we will allow the debate to unfold, bring you back in, Mr. Turner, after that. And our third guest this evening, South Africa has taken an additional step to request the ICJ to take yet further provisional measures given the non-compliance that it claims has occurred since the January ruling of that court, which you'll remember was a landmark event. This evening we're understanding what South Africa is aiming at in this new action, and also delving deeper into the latest chapter in the conflict that has engulfed Gaza. We will be back straight after this break with more of our debate. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Today, South Africa announced that it would pursue yet further provisional measures from the International Court of Justice in view of what it believes is total non-compliance with the ICJ's provisional measures order given in January. And we're in a conversation with panelists of experts from across the spectrum on this issue in a discussion and debate about where to from here with the situation in Gaza, given South Africa's recent action. Mr. Turner, before we went to the break, we were discussing South Africa's decision and its implications. Of course, you can feel free to return to the debate as you wish. But can I also bring up this question of what has happened since the ICJ's ruling? What we've seen is further military operations in Khan Yunis, now a focus on Rafah. And Many international observers, including from different parts of the world that have traditionally been allies of Israel, have grown more critical in their voice. Do you think that there has been substantial non-compliance with the ICJ's January order in the 18 days intervening?
Yeah. Firstly, can I just deal with this question of children? Because children are anyone up to 18 in the normal usage in relation to the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. And Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations actively recruit teenagers and sometimes even younger children as combatants. And younger armed people are typically put in the front line. So it's not surprising that some of the casualties are likely to be combatants under 18. And the fact that they are classed as children doesn't mean that they are not combatants. So I just want to make that clear reply to the suggestion that was being made that if they're children, they can't be fighters. That's not at all the case. And indeed, it's quite likely that quite a lot of the casualties, unfortunately, are child combatants in that sense. Now, I also want to deal with this suggestion that Lord Cameron said, well, there's nowhere for them to go. But of course, the position is that the Israeli army is now in control of large parts of the Gaza Strip, including the area to the north of Rafah, which used to be an area of Israeli settlements that were evacuated back in 2005. The Israeli residents were forced to leave there, and that is a relatively open area. So my understanding is that the Israeli plan is to make that area available for those people who fled to Rafah to move there, and perhaps others from Rafah who were living there before, in order to reduce the risk of civilian casualties. I don't think I'm aware about that remark.
Right, and just briefly, can I ask you to come to the question about the non-compliance, because the plan aside and your response to Mr. Gina aside, which I'm sure he will also respond to, what about these suggestions of, well, what seems to be obvious acts of non-compliance with the ICJ's order? Or do you believe that there has been compliance?
There has been compliance, because the court made it clear that when it made the order saying that various acts were prohibited, that was acts within the meaning of the Genocide Convention. That's to say acts that were committed with genocidal intent, with the intent of destroying a racial, national, ethnic or religious group.
Right. So you don't believe that the requisite intent is there?
Correct.
Right. Let's bring in some of our other guests, Mr. Turner, if you don't mind, because we will come back to you, but I want to make sure that our guests do get another opportunity. Mr. Sabay, thank you very much for joining us. What do you make of the suggestion that there hasn't been compliance with the ICJ's January 26th order, and that the recent actions in the days subsequent have been a flagrant act of non-compliance with that order?
I mean, there's definitely an overwhelming evidence. You're not going to get that, from your guest here, because once you actually deny that there was genocide or there's a plausible case for the genocide in the first place, I mean, it's already disputing intent. And I think there's a problem that the entire Israeli establishment does not consider itself to be, of course, committing any act of genocide. They think the carnage, the bloodbath, which I must say to you, I mean, it's unprecedented, the level of self-incrimination from, the tops of the Israeli establishment, from cabinet to members of parliament, the military and the bureaucratic apparatus of the state as a whole, as well as the actions of the ordinary soldiers who have seen taking videos and, of course, very just, expressing the excitement over the carnage and the devastation that they're inflicting on the Palestinians. And I think that is just unprecedented. I think what we have here is the fact that following the ICJ judgment, hundreds, if not thousands of people are continuing to lose their lives. They are continuing to be injured. But much more than that is a question that Rafah, which already, was, the very fact that you could put basically an equivalent of some semi-rural town and so on, over 1 million people, in and by itself, from where I stand, was an act of breach that they forced the Palestinians towards that city and so on, because the conditions are uninhabitable. That city is not meant to contain that number of people. And here you are. In addition to that, they want to carry unprecedented military operation, unprecedented in terms of brutality,
right,
but also the scale. And I think the impacts are obvious. Even the US, right? Even the US had to say there is no way that anybody who has an intention of complying with that order can, of course, support that operation. It's only people like your guest and many others that are in denial, but the evidence is overwhelming. Israel is in breach, and I think South Africa is correct in that case,
right,
to approach the ICJ and say that there must be an order. And I think the only order that has got to communicate a very clear message is that there must be an immediate ceasefire.
Right. Mr. Gina, how do you come in on this question of the actual facts of non-compliance?
So let's interpret in simple language what the first two measures of the ICJ says. The one says it's plausible that that there's genocide being committed, right? So firstly, first measure is that you must take all measures to ensure that A, B, C, D don't happen. A is killing civilians from the affected group, which is Palestinians in Gaza. Number two, the second provisional measure says your military must ensure that the above four acts don't happen. Okay, what have we seen in the past 18 days? Has there been a stopping of the killing? Because the military is to ensure that those things do not happen. No, there has not been. Has there been efforts made to ensure that civilians are not killed or injured? No. I mean, we saw 2-3 days ago, 6-year-old girl, Hind, bombed in her car. The ambulance that went to get her with communication with the Israelis to say that they are going there was blown up, right? This is a war crime. But within this context of the ICJ ruling, it's more than a war crime. It is a violation and non-compliance of a direct order from the ICJ. The issue of aid, how much of aid is being allowed in? Aid trucks get 5 security checks, 4 of them by the Israelis, before they're allowed in. That means that the amount of aid going in is minimal. The aid doesn't even get to the middle of Gaza, let alone the north of Gaza. There's an ICJ order about that, about allowing free flow of aid, right? So all of this, I mean, it's complete non-compliance. As I said earlier, as far as the Israelis are concerned, the ICJ doesn't exist. The order of the 26th of January doesn't exist, and they can continue doing whatever they want.
Can I put this question to you? Because what I am a bit confused about in the South African position, and of course this is all happening today, so I think things will be clarified, is that it seemed to me that the South African government stance was that the ICJ order was tantamount to a ceasefire, even if it didn't use those explicit words. And so I wonder why the South African government is asking for any extra step from the ICJ if it already believes that what it has got is a ceasefire in the first place.
Well, as I said earlier, it's a measure of the frustration, the helplessness, the desperation. But let me just say on the ceasefire, South Africa did not ask for a ceasefire. The ICJ did not say ceasefire. Why? Because ceasefire implies that there are two parties that you instruct. The ICJ does not have. The ICJ has jurisdiction only over member states of the UN.
It asked for the suspension of Israel's military operation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what it did. And as far as the South African interpretation is concerned, which is correct, is that when you look at those measures, effectively Israel has to stop its onslaught in order for those measures to take place. Now, to interpret it in the way that that is being interpreted here, that no, because the ICJ didn't say it's genocide, therefore we can continue killing people. I mean, that just makes absolutely no sense.
Right. Let me bring Mr. Turner in again, and I will bring you back in, Mr. Sibai. But Mr. Turner, what are your thoughts on the analysis about non-compliance and the interpretation of the ICJ order as being quite strict in terms of the kinds of acts that are prohibited under the order?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the order did not say anywhere civilians. It said killing members of the group and so on. But the court made it very clear that it was referring to those acts as set out in the Genocide Convention. That is to say, and the president of the court specifically stated this when she gave the ruling, that this meant with the intent of destroying a racial, ethnic, national, or religious group. So I think the order was very clear in that respect. And of course, they rejected South Africa's primary application, the primary demand to stop for the Israeli army stop operating altogether. So I think that was quite clear, and the Israeli army has complied with the order by not carrying out the acts prohibited by the Genocide Convention, that's to say, killing, etc., members of the group, with the intent of destroying the group, that's to say Palestinians as a whole, or possibly Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. But Hamas is not a racial, religious, ethnic or national group. It's a terrorist organization. And I think the order was very clear that Israel was not being prohibited from continuing its operations against Hamas in order to stop this genocidal organization, an organization whose leaders threatened to repeat again and again and again those acts of the 7th of October when Israeli civilians were murdered en masse, tortured, raped, burnt alive. They threatened to do that again and again, that was just a rehearsal for what is to come. Well, naturally, Israel needs to protect its civilians against that happening again. And that is what it is trying to do in very difficult conditions, with Hamas operating in, around and underneath the civilian population, with those masses of tunnels from which they can move from one place to another, making it extremely difficult to operate. And Israel is doing the Israeli army is doing its best to destroy Hamas, whilst not, whilst limiting, as far as possible, the civilian casualties, and that's entirely legitimate.
Let's go to a break. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation in light of South Africa's urgent announcement today that it will seek yet further provisional measures from the International Court of Justice relating to Israel's military operation in Gaza. We'll be back after this to explore some of the wider geopolitical questions at play. Welcome back to Unfiltered. South Africa announced today that it's going to seek further steps at the ICJ in terms of provisional measures, given that it believes Israel is in flagrant non-compliance with the January 26th order, which already announced a series of provisional measures. Mr. Sibai, we were earlier in discussion about various issues and questions and debating this issue amongst the panelists on the extent of non-compliance. What has been notable in the last few weeks, but particularly in the last week, even this week, has been a rising sense of concern even among traditional allies of Israel. What do you make of the rhetoric that is coming out of places like the EU, places like the US now, which seems to be growing in its criticism of the recent Israeli actions in Gaza?
I mean, is because, the overwhelming evidence is undeniable for anybody who wants to face the facts. It is the fact that they are under, the pressure of the hot breath of the, boiling working class discontent, which is reflected and manifested in the breathtaking scale of mass mobilization across the world. Not only, in countries like South Africa, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, but also in the very advanced, capitalist and imperialist countries like the US and London, Britain and all of that. Look at London. We had a demonstration of over 1 million people in London alone, right? In the United States itself, you had a mass movement and, led by the Jewish people, particularly young Jewish people that says, Zionism and, of course, settler colonialism in Israel does not define their Jewish identity, does not define Judaism and so on. And I think, for me, this is telling. The reality is, everyone who is on the side of human rights, of justice, any progressive person, but also just ordinary human beings, who are just being human at a very basic human level, recognize that what is happening in Gaza, what is happening today in Rafah is undefensible. That is the reason even the most hardened defenders of Israel are beginning to pull back and so on.
Right.
What you have here in the form of, Mr. Jonathan Turner and so on, is a modern day, right, apologist and propagandist of Holocaust that happened in Germany, of colonialism. You would remember when people were being killed in Africa, in colonial conquest and so on and so on, there were people that demonized them. There were people who muddied the debate and so on and so on. The reality is, we are saying people should believe what they see, what we see. He's telling you that the people, the children that we are saying are dying are members of Hamas. He's telling you that children that are dying in incubators, right? Barely few days are members of Hamas. He's telling you that those 3 years, those 2 years old and so on and so on, those are people that we see dying. The elderly, the women, we know that are certainly not the combatants in the struggle.
Mr. Turner, on this theme, it does seem that even Israel's staunchest allies are beginning to voice increasing concern. We had President Biden saying that the operation was going over the top. We've of course had many UN officials speaking, but recently Mr. Lurker, the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, said, and I quote, "Rafah is a pressure cooker of despair and we fear for what comes next." It seems like the tenor of the global conversation has shifted somewhat. Is that your sense? And how does Israel continue to argue that it is on the moral side of this question when even its allies are beginning to voice these concerns?
Well, the UN is usually hostile to Israel and misinformed, and many of its statements and reports are just inaccurate, unfortunately. And UN bodies are heavily...
President Biden hasn't been.
Yes. I think that his assessment is wrong, actually. That Israel really does have to persevere with this. Of course, he is going into an election and wants to have support from people across the American electorate. And that may lead him to say things that seem to provide, perhaps seem to make him look balanced to different people. But I think it is fair to say that the Israeli expression of intention to finish off Hamas in Rafah did need to be accompanied by a plan for the civilians who are living in Gaza, in Rafah. And I think to that extent, it was entirely reasonable for friends of Israel to point out that a realistic plan needs to be prepared. But Israel is doing that, as I understand it. I think we should see what unfolds.
Right. So
I don't think we should rush to judgment on this without knowing what they are actually going to do.
Mr. Gina, on that note, the EU's foreign policy chief, Mr. Josep Borrell, I think yesterday said, well, and this was in response to the US. So even some of the US's allies seem to be pressuring the US, which in turn seems to be pressuring Israel, said, well, if you believe that too many people, he's talking to the US now, are being killed in response to President Biden's recent statements, maybe you should provide less arms in order to prevent so many people being killed. This is the EU's policy chief and not a pro-Hamas radical. It does seem that there is increasing pressure on Israel from the EU, from the US, and even from some Australian officials recently.
Israel doesn't care. I mean, you saw it in Jonathan Turner's response. Israel doesn't care. Israel is always right. No matter who says what, Israel is always right. The UN Secretary General is a terrorist. The UN Security Council enables terrorism. The UN General Assembly is terrorist. UNRWA is harbors terrorists. That's why all its schools have been bombed and its clinics have been bombed. The WHO is terrorist. Everyone is a terrorist. And now, I mean, Biden also is almost a terrorist because he's saying wrong things. So Israel doesn't care. It will only care, forget Joseph Borrell and all of that. It will only care if the United States president uses the leverage that he has, which is to say that if you continue down this genocidal path, we will stop your aid. That's the only way it'll make a difference. Biden, however, has emphasized that he's a Zionist and wants to prove to everyone that he's a Zionist, and he's not going down that road. Privately, he might swear at Netanyahu, as we know, but private swearing doesn't mean anything. What means something is official policy. Now, let me also just say this. These lies about October 7th need to be addressed. There's no evidence that rapes took place on October 7th, right? The story about Israeli civilians being burned to death is correct. Who burned them to death? Israeli tank shells. The story of civilians being killed is correct. Many of those civilians were killed by Apache helicopters from the Israeli side. Where do I get all this from? Not from Hamas media, from Israeli media. Israeli newspapers. The story about the Apache helicopters killing Israeli civilians in the Nova Music Festival is an Israeli police investigation covered by Israeli media. So the way that we get to the truth, Mr. Turner, the way that we get to the truth is we have an international independent investigation, and all sides must agree that if they are pointed out to be wrong, to have committed war crimes, they will hand over their people, including Hamas, including the PFLP, including Islamic Jihad, and the Israeli government. But the Israeli government refuses. They won't allow the UN Special Rapporteur in. They won't allow any investigation that is impartial in. They didn't even allow the Goldstone Commission to go in. They won't allow anything that is that might find the truth, that might find that their narrative is not correct. But this is their narrative, that Israeli civilians were killed by Israeli tank shells. Palestinians don't have tanks. Is their narrative. That Apache helicopters shot them is their narrative. That many of the people in the festival were killed in the crossfire, but mostly by Israeli soldiers, is their narrative. Israeli witnesses it's in the Israeli radio, in Israeli newspapers, right? So yes, civilians were killed, and all of those who were responsible for killing civilians must be brought to justice. And the only way we'll know who was responsible is with an independent investigation. Will Mr. Turner support an independent investigation? No, he won't, because that's not the Israeli line, because the only truth is what Israel says is true. Even Joe Biden lies. The only truth is Israel.
Right, we will come back after this with our final segment. We are in a conversation, a debate about the situation in Gaza, which we've been following closely on this show. Today, South Africa announced that in addition to the provisional measures that were put forward by the International Court of Justice, ordered by the International Court of Justice late in January, as you may recall, They are seeking yet additional provisional measures given what they call an urgent situation in violation of the earlier order. And tonight we're debating the wisdom of that move, but also the unfolding and continuing unfolding situation in Gaza as it shifts into a new chapter, particularly focusing on the area and the city-town of Rafah. When we come back after the break, having debated various issues, we'll look at the way forward and we'll assess where to from here for a sustainable and lasting possible peace. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're in conversation about South Africa's decision today to return to the ICJ for further provisional measures around Israel's military operation in Gaza. Mr. Turner, can I come to you and to now turn attention to the future? Of course, we've been having a long debate, and I'm sure you'll want to weigh in on some of the things that have been said, but can we hear your perspective on where to from here, how we can forge a sustainable peace going forward, and what the steps towards that should be from your perspective?
Yes, but I do just want to say that the professor has shown his true colours. There is such ample evidence of the Hamas atrocities from their own cameras, from their own videos, that it is just ridiculous to be suggesting that there were not mass atrocities committed.
He will
by
not accept an independent inquiry. Got it. Okay.
One of the problems is that the UN has this habit of appointing anti-Semitic, racist panelists to these inquiries and racist staff and so on. It's deeply unsatisfactory, and Israel has every right to reject that kind of operation. But coming to the future, this is one thing that I think we should keep in our sights, because Hamas, the terrorist organization, being in control of the Gaza Strip since 2005, has been a major problem, a major barrier to any progress towards resolving this long-standing conflict. If Hamas is successfully removed by Israel, and it really does have to be removed, because if you try and install some kind of Palestinian authority, either the existing one or a better one, in Gaza, whilst Hamas is still there, whilst it still has operational military capability, they will overwhelm the Palestinian authority, as they did before. And so you really have to have that threat eliminated in order to make some kind of progress in future. But I do think that paradoxically, it's not the way it should have happened, it is terrible that so many people have lost their lives in dealing with the situation. But nevertheless, there is a potential opportunity to actually make some kind of progress now. And I really do hope that that will happen.
Mr. Sabay, how do you respond? And as we look to the future, what do you think the next steps should be to move us out of this terrible crisis and situation that has lasted for so long?
Firstly, we've got to look at what is really the view of the Israeli establishment. Mr. Turner will want you to believe that there's no intention to commit genocide, right? But the evidence is there. I mean, when you look at the debate within, the political leadership, the cabinet, there's only two views. The question is, where else do you take the Gazans if you can bomb them, all of them, to death? And that is evident in the fact that you have a prime minister who says, the head of government, who says they are negotiating with Congo for the purpose of relocating the Palestinians in Gaza. You have other ministers, the most extreme right wing says they have to force them into Egypt. That's the debate that is going on. That is ethnic cleansing. And if in that is not lost the logic of genocide that brutally manifests itself in the mass killing and complete devastation of the infrastructure, I don't know what else is. The reality is People like Mr. Turner and others who are, propagandists of that, these people are racist. We need to be absolutely clear about that. They do not think that people like you and I, the Palestinians, and all these other non-white people have the same right as they have. You would remember that the very same Israel that they defend, they said this under apartheid, that when they assisted apartheid regime to acquire a nuclear weapon, what did you think that nuclear weapon was meant for on the part of apartheid? To defend itself against who? Against the black majority in this country, against the black majority in the southern Africa and so on, who sought the independence that I and you sought, and of course the freedom that we have, including to have this conversation, where Mr. Turner can of course participate, of course, to promote what essentially is bigotry in so far as I'm concerned. What is the future? I do think that we must demand an immediate ceasefire. There must be cessation of hostility on the part of Israel. But I must also say to you, from where I'm standing, that to us does not mean the cessation of the struggle on the part of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people have the right to resist, including by means of an armed resistance. I'm critical of Hamas, but not for the same reason that they are. I do not think their strategy is effective in bringing about a genuine liberation of the Palestinians. I'm a Marxist. I do believe that the working class of Palestine need to organize themselves in the independent movement on the basis of a class and a socialist program to dismantle that colonial occupation, the Israelis, Zionist apparatus, and to ensure a genuine free Palestine on the basis of the socialist federation from the river to the sea that guarantee the right of self-determination for all the groups, but also on the basis that nobody will be dispossessed of the land. All the refugees, millions of Palestinians scattered across the world, will have the right of return, and there will be prosperity for everybody, including, of course, addressing all the aspirations of the Palestinians for jobs, for education, for quality health,
and of course, for
a better life for all.
Let me bring in Mr. Gina on the same question.
First, let me say, I think Jonathan Turner shows his colonial colors. When in the middle of a genocide, you use terminology such as finish the job. When you say we must remove those ones and install someone in their place, well, that sounds like P.W. Botha talking about Baputa Tswana, where you install Bantustan leaders. I'm sorry. Hamas was elected in 2006. Hamas, the PFLP, the Al-Aqsa brigades, Al-Quds brigades, and yes, this shows my colors. They are resistance movements that under international law have the right to resist occupation, have the right to resist colonialism. That is in the Geneva Conventions, that is in numerous UN Security Council resolutions that talk about South Africa, Namibia, Cameroon, including Palestine. They have the right to resist, including armed struggle. It says, the resolutions say that, including armed struggle, right? If there are atrocities and war crimes committed, people must be held accountable for that. Even in a liberation struggle, there's no one has the right to commit atrocities. They must be held accountable. But they are legitimate resistance and liberation movements. You're not going to remove them because they are part of the people. So this nonsense about saying, well, the solution is let's get rid of Hamas. In 1948, when 700,000 Palestinians were made refugees, when 540 Palestinian towns and villages, including 22 around Gaza, were depopulated and destroyed, there was no Hamas. There was no Islamic Jihad. There wasn't even PLO at that time. Okay? So don't use Hamas, don't use the liberation movement as an excuse for your genocide. Right? What is the future? Immediately a ceasefire. Right? Then obeying international law. I have my problems with international law. But international law, immediately. Okay? International law regarding torture, regarding war crimes, regarding dismantling all the settlements in the West Bank which are illegal under international law, returning sovereignty to the Palestinian people over the territory that's supposed to be theirs, removing the annexation of Jerusalem, because that annexation is illegal under international law. The occupation is illegal under international law. Right? Obeying international law, Israel refuses to do that because Israel's plan is genocide. From 1948, they have wanted to get rid of all Palestinians. They didn't finish the job then, Mr. Turner. They're not going to finish the job now because Palestinians will continue resisting and will win their freedom.
I'm afraid we're running out of time this evening, and of course this is a long-standing and long-running debate and not one that we're going to resolve this evening. But I'd like to thank all my panelists, Mr. Turner, Mr. Sabay and Mr. Gina, for engaging and for bringing their perspectives to the audience this evening. Thank you very much for joining us on this important evening as South Africa has announced that it will seek yet further provisional measures in the situation in Gaza. Let's hear some of your thoughts following from our debate on social media at Unfiltered SABC. We thank our panelists, we thank you for this evening, and thank you for tuning in to another installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good evening.